So this is the third episode of the Industry Innovators, looking number 3 with Meg O'Connell. Today we're going to be covering disability hiring, disability employment. This is an area where Meg is an absolute expert. She's done it with the world's biggest brands. So before I introduce you, could you just kind of give us a bit of a flavor for who you are, what you do, and what your message is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Cian. I appreciate being on the podcast. Yeah, our company, Global Disability Inclusion, we help organizations expand their diversity initiatives to include people with disabilities. So we help define an organization's strategy and approach to disability inclusion, and we also help with implementation and rollout. So we want to be there to help companies get it right. We know sometimes there's a lot of fear around disability and disability employment. So we want to help companies get over that so they can see it for the competitive advantage it is.
Nice. And as a group, how long has your business been going? What type of supply chain businesses or general businesses do you tend to work with?
Yeah, we've been around for 10 years at this point. I personally have been doing this work for about 25, so a long history in this space. We have, like you said, we've worked with some of the biggest brands in the industry, from Lowe's to Michael's to Toys R Us back in the day, Procter and Gamble, Pepsi, UPS. So we've worked with some of the largest brands in the industry.
Nice. So I guess that brings me into something that you mentioned right at the very start of your introduction, which is, what are the key points that any new business that you haven't worked with need to know about hiring people with disability? Because you mentioned an apprehension of doing so. So how do we reduce that apprehension?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think first and foremost, when we talk to employers, we tell them, you're doing this already. You just don't realize it. 1 in 4 adults in the US, and it's 1 in 6 around the world, has a disability, and most of those disabilities are invisible, whether it's a learning disability or mental health, or maybe someone is neurodivergent, whatever the case may be. You're doing it already. Your people just aren't telling you about their disabilities. So that would be the first thing, to help them recognize that it's already happening. The second point is, a lot of times people think disability employment means, oh, this is part of a charitable endeavor, our opportunity to give back to the community. Yes, and it can be those things, but what we really want is to help folks understand that it's not about lowering standards or performance requirements or expectations. Just like any other diversity group, it's finding the right talent to do the job that happens to have a disability. So we don't want you to change standards or expectations when you think about hiring people with disabilities.
Yeah. And do you generally see a bit of a stigma of the word disability? How have you worked in removing that barrier for organizations? You mentioned a bit there, but I just thought I'd go one step further.
Yeah. And I think, it's such a good point, because language changes over time and evolves. When I first started, shortly after in the US, the ADA was passed in 1990. It was very much person first language. You would say Meg is a person with epilepsy. You wouldn't say, oh, that epileptic, or oh, the blind person.
Yep.
And now that we have, the millennials, the Gen Zs, who grew up with this legislation and talking about disability and disability inclusion, there's been a lot of movement in taking back the power of that word of, disability is not a dirty word.
Yeah.
So there are campaigns like, disabled and capable, and disability is not a dirty word, those types of things. So we just work to educate that, disability is a characteristic, just like someone who has blonde hair or blue eyes. It's just a part of who you are. It's not all of who you are.
Yeah, I think that's really important in not, having disability define who you are, because I think I shared with you really early on, when we were having conversations around doing this. And I have a younger brother who has one eye. He's, had an eye problem when he was younger, which led to him only having vision out of one eye. And he is disabled, but he's also, that doesn't characterize who he is and what he can do. So really removing those barriers is something that I'm passionate about, and you're obviously passionate about,
Yeah.
which really takes me on to the next question. It's something we discussed earlier on, is how do we roll out a disability employment program to every DC and every operation and business, in the US? It's a big goal, but how do we do it? How do we go about it?
Oh my God, how much fun would that be, right? I mean, it would be so great. And I wish I had the silver bullet to say, if we do these three things, it would all
Yeah.
happen. But, I would love to see a cohort of companies in this space come together, like 10 companies say, we want to do this. Let's roll this out. Let's capture data and continue to spread the message that this works, because we know disability employment is a competitive advantage. We've seen it over and over, warehouse after warehouse, that 90% of employees with disabilities perform at the same rate or better than their non-disabled colleagues. They have 48% greater tenure, so they stay on the job almost 50% longer. It's 42% less absenteeism and 34% fewer safety incidences. So this is not just a one-off. Those are stats from a study Walgreens did several years ago that was published in Safety and Management magazine. But we've seen this over and over again in every distribution center that we've worked in. So I think when you think about it in that way, and we know historically supply chain distribution has a fair amount of turnover, this is competitive for everybody. You've got employees staying longer, they show up more, they have less safety incidences. That's money in the bank for every company that's thinking about doing this. So I think having willing participants say, hey, we want to give this a try, let's pilot it in a few locations and then roll it out for our organization, companies can really see the benefits over and over.
Yeah, and we talk about, it's so interesting because we talk about automation technologies, and this comes back into, the industry that I specifically work in was in warehouse automation. We talk about robotics and conveyance and sortation and all these different technologies being the solution to labor shortages, but it's almost as if it's a completely untapped resource for employers to look at even before they go ahead and put in these massive automated systems. The simple thing is looking at disability employment. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see, when you talk about how do we expand this, we also know a lot of warehouses use temp agencies, bring somebody on for the first 90 days. Once they're making rate, we'll convert them to full-time employee. So we really need to get the sourcing, the pipeline focused on talent with disabilities as well, and not just a separate initiative. Technology has been a great equalizer for people with disabilities, and the greatest technology we have is in the palm of our hand, right? I mean,
Yep.
You can find sign language interpreting apps that will let you speak, and then the person will sign to someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. You can get time tracking if you need somebody focusing on a specific task at a time. So there are lots of tools and resources that people with disabilities use that are just in the palm of their hand. Of course, there are those that might need other equipment that is more robust, but the majority of accommodations or things that people need are either things that they already have access to, or allowing, I know, phones in a lot of warehouses are not allowed on the floor. There are places that make exception for, if someone is deaf or hard of hearing, there are devices that are text only that would vibrate. So if there was an emergency or the employee had a question, they can reach out to a manager. So there are workarounds in any situation that will make it viable for both the standards for the company and for the employee to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's so important. And we talked about, the second question that I asked about how we roll that program to every DC, every operation company in the world. I mean, we said it'd be fun, but you've done this over and over. So can you just talk me through an example with, Lowe's, Toys R Us, Michael's, whoever it may be, where you've helped bring awareness to the organization and actually roll out a disability employment program?
Yeah, and since Michael's is a current client, I'll start with them. We're in our third year with Michael's. They are such a great client because they're very willing, and they're the type of client that is like, okay, and what's next? So there hasn't been a big resistance that sometimes we see, or where we have to do a lot of education on the front end. So we started in 2020, which was a tough year to start, right?
Yeah.
We had started actually late 2019 with an assessment and really doing some strategy planning with Michael's, kind of understanding where they were at that time and what we would recommend so that their infrastructure was prepared to bring people on. So what policies, programs, procedures did they have? The right accommodations processes in place? Were there gaps in that we needed to help fill to make sure that it was successful? And so in 2020 was the perfect time to run a small pilot because supply chain was still moving faster probably than most industries. And so we started in their 8 distribution centers, 1 manufacturing facility, and 25 of their stores. So each location started small. Let's do 1 to 2 hires in each place. With the exception of 1 brand new DC that had to staff up to like 700 people. So we did a lot of training and education with the team. We were very high touch that first year, helping them find partners in their community, whether it's a nonprofit partner or a state agency, really educating them on doing that process, being part of those interviews. And then we began hiring, and we put together a leader's guide for the distribution center, the manufacturing facility, and their stores. That really was, here are all the Michael's resources. Here's what the program is. Here's your, quick answers to questions that you may have. And then, of course, we did monthly trainings and answered questions and tackled things head on. And after that first year, we really had the opportunity to assess how the program was going. What did we want to do differently? What did we want to change? Were there areas to course correct? And then when we did that and sat down, and we had such great buy-in and enthusiasm from the pilot, the organization said, okay, next year, let's roll out to the remaining manufacturing facilities and 150 stores.
Wow.
So what we started doing was building cohorts within the organization, which is such a great way to embed knowledge into the organization. So it's not person-centric. Sometimes you can have a key champion that's excited about an initiative, and then they leave, and then the initiative dies. So what we were building with that cohort structure, the first group of pilot stores and DCs became the coaches and mentors to the next 150 stores that launched. So we were building in, we were still providing training and education, but we were building in a coaching mentoring system that allowed them to ask their peers, hey, how'd you handle this when this happened? What was the best practice for you when this came up? So they're really creating that culture of helping one another. So we're now in our third year, rolling out to another 150 stores. We've had over 300 hires at this point. Again, building off the cohort model year over year. So this is now the second or third cohort from the pilot, or including the pilot.
Mhm.
And again, the excitement, the energy, we're building leaders and champions across the organization. And it's just been such a great project to work on because of the culture of inclusion that Michael's has. We didn't have to try to affect that change. It was already there,
Yeah.
which is what makes it so fantastic. And I say it all the time, they're my favorite client because of that. They're really energetic, they're enthusiastic, they want to get this right, and they have that energy at every level of the organization. So for me and my team, it's been a really fun project to work on.
Nice. And specifically, like we talked about that study that you conducted with Walgreens, and we talked about those impactful statistics about, the impact of disability employment programs. Have you seen a similar set of results within the Michaels organization?
Absolutely. We're seeing the same thing. Greater tenure, performance is on par or better, less absenteeism, all of those things we see over and over again. Companies wouldn't continue to do this if they weren't seeing those results. And we've had
Yeah.
some industries, and I won't name names, where they've had, 82, 84% turnover, and that drops by 20 percentage points when they start hiring people with disabilities. So it's a win for everybody.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly does sound like a win. And I guess it must have been a few questions ago, but we talked about, disability employment being a really powerful, and we've talked about it throughout the podcast, but really powerful tool in terms of, finding people to grow the organization. You talk about a DC startup with 700 people. I'm sure a meaningful statistic of that proportion was people with disability. And in these new startup DCs, you see more and more investment in automation technology. So this question would probably, be very useful to executives within the warehouse automation market. But from what you've seen yourself, Meg, what are the top three technology or warehouse automation disability inclusive technologies, if that makes sense?
Gosh, yeah, there are so many warehouse management systems right out there now, but they have evolved from when we first started in this space, 10, 15 years ago, to being very kind of what we think of the old green screen with lots of words on them, to things with uh, step-by-step instructions with pictures associated with it, with here's the box you should pack this thing in, is this size, so it really works, not for just for people with disabilities, but people that maybe English is their second language, and they need a little extra instruction in getting the steps done. We also see, things like Pick to Light is a great automation that helps people move faster and know where to go. And that works for everybody. That's not just for people with disabilities. And that's the other point that I would make when we talk about technology in general, at least in the disability space. We always say design for disability, because if you design for disability, you're actually creating a better environment for everybody. So think of, the automatic door that you use when you have an armful of stuff in a suitcase, the curb cut for your suitcase, or a mom with a stroller. These were things that were built for people with disabilities, and everybody thought, oh, they're going to be the only ones that use them. But then they work for everybody. So when we talk about technologies and talk to firms that are building tools, we always have that mantra: design for disability. Think about the people with disabilities that will be using this product or service, or this tool within your warehouse. How will it work for them? So I think that's the biggest message in whatever you're creating or whatever you're using. Make sure that it has that component. And I would ask your vendors, what are they doing to make sure they're being disability inclusive? Because if you start asking the questions of the companies that are that are providing the warehouse management systems, they'll start asking those questions internally, and then working with their teams to make sure that they are completely accessible.
Yeah, and that just makes what your objective is so much easier if that technology exists, because it removes another barrier from your consulting to a firm like Michaels. And one of the newer things that is being brought up every single time we talk about technology, every time we talk about warehouse automation, robotics, is AI. And it's a question from the last executive that I interviewed, a good friend of yours, Heather Carroll. So within your own work and within your clients' portfolios, how have you thought about AI, and how have you leveraged it in your own business to maybe roll out disability programs?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's always fun to talk to Heather about that because she's kind of on the forefront of AI in this industry and where it
Yeah,
could go. And so for us, we're still getting up to speed and learning like the rest of the world, right? But I think it can be a real game changer. I think when we think about what the internet did for the world,
yeah,
5, 10 years, we're going to be saying AI has done something similar for the world. And so again, we've just been getting started. We've used it for things like codifying research that we needed to present. We've crafted some marketing messages like, "Oh, here's our idea. Make this more creative," that
yeah,
type of thing. But yeah, we've got a lot to learn in the space, and in fact, our team is taking some classes on AI just so we can get smarter on it
yeah.
because it's here and we might as well use it and know how to use it and all the potential it has to offer us.
Yeah. I think about AI, it's so interesting because especially within the UK, and this is what I've seen myself, you see the skill sets that have been useful within businesses for the last 10, 15 years, and you look at the impact of AI over the next 5 years, and there's just complete reclassification of what the key skills needed are. And it's going to be
Mhm.
so interesting to see how that transpires into the future workforce. And again, on your side, I'm sure it's going to be really interesting in how you roll out these programs to companies like Michael's, because you know changing skill sets is difficult for me, for you, for everybody. So how do we adapt to it, and how do we make it more comfortable for people with roadblocks to using it, for example?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's like anything, right? Everybody has a learning curve. Everyone has the story of their, 5-year-old that can zip around on their phone or, find something on the internet. So,
yeah,
there are going to be digital natives to AI very soon. So I think it's on all of us to learn the capabilities and understand how it impacts our industry, which
yeah,
is why we're working to get smart on it. But I think it's seeing how we can leverage it to help more people with disabilities and employment is a great idea.
yeah. Yeah, so we've had that from Heather and a previous guest as well. So the question now goes out to you, and you get the chance to ask the next person that I interview. Um, what do you want to ask of your fellow supply chain executive? What do you want to hear from them?
I think this goes back to your question and how do we roll this out to
Yeah,
every distribution center supply chain organization in the world? So my question is, why aren't you doing this? The data is clear that performance is the same, 10 years longer, all of those things we've already talked about. So, what's preventing you from actually doing this within your organization? And I think if we can get at the answer to that, we can achieve what you asked in your question of how do we roll this out
yeah,
globally within the industry.
yeah, amazing. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been great to have you on as a guest, and the message that you have is so important. So hopefully we'll be able to share it around the whole supply chain industry, and not just supply chain, but more generally. It's a message that needs to be sent across the world. So I really appreciate your time and sharing it with me, sharing it with my network, and look forward to working with you. Just in educating myself more around disability employment in the future.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.